In this class, I'm going to show you a trick that you can use to acquire hundreds of vocabulary words without memorization. I'm referring to the wonderful world of cognates. Don't go away. Hola, and welcome to Spanish with El Güero. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, well, subscribe so that you don't miss any classes. And while you're at it, why don't you give this video a like? So, as I said, in this class, we're going to learn about cognates. And to start learning Spanish from zero, click here. Cognates are words in both languages that look and sound either the same or almost the same, and they mean the same thing. The Spanish and the English languages are made up of about 40% cognates because they both have roots in Latin. Spanish itself is a Latin language, while English is a Germanic language which has been mixed with French, which is another Latin language. And that is why Spanish and English have a lot of words with the same root. These words tend to be spelled very similarly, if not identical, and sound very similar as well. And the great thing is, they mean the same thing. For example, in Spanish, the word animal is animal. Animal. It is spelled exactly the same as in English, and the pronunciation is just a little bit different because, of course, it has a Spanish pronunciation and not an English pronunciation. Animal, animal. Famous in Spanish is famoso. Famoso. It is spelled very similarly and sounds similar as well, and it means the same thing. Famous, famoso. Doctor in Spanish is doctor. Doctor. It is spelled exactly the same and sounds similar. Action in Spanish is acción. Acción. Eternity in Spanish is eternidad. Eternidad. So we can see that all of these words are either spelled identical or similarly in English and Spanish. They sound similar and they mean the same thing. These are cognates, and there are a lot of them between English and Spanish. Hundreds of them. And the great news is there are categories of cognates. You just need to learn the conversion. You need to learn the ending in English, how to convert that ending into Spanish, and then you know the word without ever looking it up in the dictionary or memorizing it. These are the categories of cognates between English and Spanish. First, we have the categories that don't change at all. If a word in English ends in AL, BLE, TOR, or LAR, it is usually spelled exactly the same in Spanish. And then you just have to give it a Spanish pronunciation. Then we have the categories in which we just add a letter to the end. We have ment to mento, ism to ismo, ist to ista, CT to CTO, ic to ico or ica, id to ido, and NT to NTE. As you can see, in all of these categories, we just add a letter to the end. And then there are other categories in which we don't just add something, we change something. We have tion, Tion, to ssion, Cion. We have shan, Ssion, to ssion, Sion. We have iri to idad. We have NCE to NCIA. Us to oso. Eri to ario. Iv to ibo. E to yo or ya. Il to il. Eight to ar. And ifi to ificar. So all you have to do is learn the conversion. And then whenever you want to say a word with one of these endings in Spanish, you know how to convert it. So you don't have to look it up or memorize it. So now we're going to look at some examples with most of these categories. This video isn't long enough to see examples in every category, but by the end of the video, you'll get the idea. First, we have words that end in AL. These usually also end in AL in Spanish. They're spelled the same. We already saw that animal is animal. In the same vein, principal is principal. Principal. Normal is normal. Normal. Real is real. Real. Metal is metal. Metal. As you can see, these words are spelled the same in English and Spanish, but we have to give them a Spanish pronunciation. Pronounce the letters the way they are pronounced in Spanish and not in English. The accent goes on the last syllable because remember, in English, if a word ends in a consonant other than S or N, then the accent goes on that last syllable. Animal, principal, normal, real, metal. These are just a few examples. They are not the only ones. There are many words that end in AL, both in English and in Spanish. So whenever you want to say a word in Spanish that ends in AL in English, you already know how to say it in Spanish. Words in English that end in BLE also end in BLE in Spanish. For example, probable becomes probable. Probable. In Spanish, that E at the end is not silent. In Spanish, the only vowel that can be silent is the U, and that is only in a very specific situation that we saw in a previous video. And if you want to watch that video, you can click here. So the E is never silent, and so this word in Spanish is pronounced probable. Memorable, memorable, memorable. Adorable, adorable, adorable. Cable, cable, cable. Favorable, favorable, favorable. In this case, the accent goes on the second to last syllable because these words do not end in a consonant other than S or N. Probable, memorable, adorable, cable, favorable. Words in English that end in TOR also end in TOR in Spanish. For example, doctor becomes doctor, doctor. Actor, actor, actor. Factor, factor, factor. Sector, sector, sector. Director, director, director. These words have the accent on the last syllable because R is a consonant and it's not S or N, and so we put the accent on the last syllable. Doctor, actor, factor, sector, director. Words that end in LAR in English also end in LAR in Spanish. For example, muscular becomes muscular, muscular. Circular becomes circular, circular. Solar, solar, solar. Similar, similar, similar. Popular, popular, popular. So remember, we have to give these words a Spanish pronunciation because they are Spanish words and not English words. In Spanish, the U is always U. It is never a and it is never U. So it is not muscular, it is muscular. It is not popular, it is popular. Muscular, circular, solar, similar, popular. And now let's see some examples in the categories where we add a letter at the end. Words that end in ment in English and in mento in Spanish. We add an O. So moment becomes momento. Momento. Document. Documento. Documento. Element. Elemento. Elemento. Cement. Cemento. Cemento. Segment. Segmento. Segmento. The accent goes on the second to last syllable because these words do not end in a consonant other than S or N. These are not the only ones, as in all of the examples that I have been giving. These are just a few examples in each category. There are many words in each of these categories. And if you know how the word ends in English, which you do, then you know how it ends in Spanish if you know the conversion. Momento, documento, elemento, cemento, segmento. Words that end in ism in English and in ismo in Spanish. We add an O. And remember, the sound I does not exist in Spanish. And so it is not ismo, it is ismo. The I is pronounced I, ismo. For example, racism becomes racismo, racismo. Idealism, idealismo, idealismo. Organism, organismo, organismo. Realism, realismo, realismo. Autism, autismo, autismo. Remember to pronounce each of the letters the way that it is pronounced in Spanish and not in English. Racismo, idealismo, organismo, realismo, autismo. Words that end in ist in English and in ista in Spanish. For example, dentist becomes dentista, dentista. Artist becomes artista, artista. Realist, realista, realista. Pianist, pianista, pianista. Linguist, linguista, linguista. These words always end in A, no matter what the gender or sex of the person being referred to is. If we're referring to a male dentist, it is still dentista. El dentista. If we're referring to a female dentist, it is still dentista. La dentista. Un dentista is a male dentist. Una dentista is a female dentist. It doesn't matter if the person is male or female. We still say ista, dentista. And that applies to all of the words in Spanish that end in ista. Dentista, artista, realista, pianista, linguista. Words that end in CT in English end in CTO in Spanish. For example, direct becomes directo, directo. Correct becomes correcto, correcto. Exact becomes exacto, exacto. Impact, impacto, impacto. Perfect, perfecto, perfecto. We just add an O and we give all of the letters a Spanish pronunciation. Directo, correcto, exacto, impacto, perfecto. Words that end in IC in English end either in ICO or ICA in Spanish. Most of these words are adjectives, so they end in ICO if they're referring to a masculine noun, or ICA if they're referring to a feminine noun. For example, basic becomes básico. Básico. Civic becomes cívico. Cívico. Toxic becomes tóxico. Tóxico. These words could all end in A as well. If they're referring to a feminine noun, then they would be básica, cívica, and tóxica. There are some nouns that end in IC in English, and these nouns, when you convert them to Spanish, they always end in ICA. So, for example, music is música. Música. Only adjectives can either end in ICO or ICA, depending on the noun that they describe. But all nouns that end in IC in English end in ICA in Spanish. Music, música. When we're speaking about logic, the logic, it is always lógica, la lógica, etc. And as you can see, when we convert these words to ICO or ICA, we always add an accent mark to the third to last syllable. In Spanish, all of these words that end in ICO or ICA have the accent on the third to last syllable. And in Spanish, that is unnatural, and so you have to write an accent mark. Básico, lógica, cívico, tóxico, música. Words that end in ID in English end in IDO in Spanish. For example, rapid becomes rápido, rápido. Solid becomes sólido, sólido. Lucid becomes lúcido, lúcido. Timid becomes tímido, tímido. Valid becomes válido, válido. As you can see in this category as well, when we add the O to convert these words into Spanish words, we also have to add an accent mark on the third to last syllable. All of these words in this category also have the accent on the third to last syllable, so you have to write that accent mark over the vowel in that syllable. Rápido, sólido, lúcido, tímido, válido. So now you know the conversion, and so you don't have to look up or memorize any of these words. Words in English that end in tion, T-I-O-N, end in ssion in Spanish, C-I-O-N. But you have to put an accent mark on that O, because the accent goes on the last syllable. And in Spanish, if a word ends with N or S, the accent does not go on the last syllable, usually. That's the rule. So if you need it to go on that last syllable, you have to write an accent mark. So for all of these words that convert from T-I-O-N to C-I-O-N, you must write an accent over that O. For example, action becomes acción, acción. Nation becomes nación, nación. Option becomes opción, opción. Edition becomes edición, edición. Emotion becomes emoción, emoción. So don't forget to write the accent mark over the O when you write these words, and don't forget to put the stress on the last syllable when you pronounce them. There is no SH sound in these words. In English, there is. In English, we know that TI, when it comes before a vowel, is pronounced like SH, action. And so a lot of times when English speakers speak Spanish and they pronounce these words, they pronounce an SH sound. That does not exist in Spanish. It is not acción, it is acción. A hard C followed by a soft C, which is just like the S, acción. There are a ton of words in this category. So many words end in tion in English, and almost all of them end in cion in Spanish. Acción, nación, opción, edición, emoción. But there are other words in English that also end in shun, but it is spelled ssion. These words in Spanish also end in tion, but instead of cion, it is spelled sion, also with an accent over the O. The accent goes on the last syllable. For example, mission becomes misión, misión. Passion, pasión, pasión. Session, sesión, sesión. Omission, omisión, omisión. Depression, depresión, depresión. Again, remember to write these words with an accent mark over the O and to pronounce them with a stress on the last syllable. Misión, pasión, sesión, omisión, depresión. Words that end in ity in English end in idad, idad, in Spanish. For example, activity becomes actividad, actividad. Eternity, eternidad, eternidad. Humanity, humanidad, humanidad. Unity, unidad, unidad. Vanity, vanidad, vanidad. The accent goes on the last syllable because these words end in D. And in Spanish, if a word ends in any consonant besides S or N, then the accent goes on the last syllable. Remember to give each of the letters a Spanish pronunciation. Actividad, eternidad, humanidad, unidad, vanidad. Words that end in OUS in English usually end in OSO in Spanish, oso. For example, famous becomes famoso, famoso. Glorious becomes glorioso, glorioso. Delicious, delicioso, delicioso. Curious, curioso, curioso. Generous, generoso, generoso. Again, remember to give each of the letters a Spanish pronunciation. Famoso, glorioso, delicioso, curioso, generoso. Words that end in IVE in English end in IVO in Spanish. For example, native becomes nativo, nativo. Active becomes activo, activo. Abusive becomes abusivo, abusivo. Positive becomes positivo, positivo. Negative becomes negativo, negativo. Remember, in Spanish, the V is usually pronounced like a B. There are some very small parts of Latin America where they pronounce the V as we pronounce it in English. But in the great majority of Latin America and in Spain, the V is pronounced like a B. Nativo, activo, abusivo, positivo, negativo. There are many verbs in English that end in ify, ify. These verbs in Spanish end in ificar. For example, modify becomes modificar, modificar. Verify, verificar, verificar. Notify, notificar, notificar. Justify, justificar, justificar. Magnify, magnificar, magnificar. The accent on these words goes on the last syllable because they end with R, and R is a consonant other than S or N. So the accent goes on the last syllable. And once again, remember to pronounce each letter as it's pronounced in Spanish. Modificar, verificar, notificar, justificar, magnificar. And so with that, we have seen examples in most of the categories of cognates. As I said, there isn't time in this class to see examples in every category, but you get the idea. If you know the conversion, that if the word ends in this in English, then it ends in this in Spanish, then all you have to do is convert it in your head. You don't need to look it up or memorize it. With this trick, memorizing the categories of cognates, you can acquire hundreds of vocabulary words without ever having to memorize anything. And as I said, there are many more words in each of these categories. I only gave 5 examples of each, but there are many more. Another thing that you need to understand is that it doesn't always work. It works 95 to 99% of the time, but there are some words for which this does not work. There are also some words that are pronounced similarly and also spelled similarly, if not exactly the same in English and Spanish, but they do not mean the same thing. These are called false cognates, and they can confuse people because you think you know what the word is, but you really don't. There are far fewer false cognates than cognates. There are only a few dozen false cognates, while there are hundreds of real cognates. And in our next class, we will learn the false cognates so that you can avoid them. And that's our class for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it was useful for you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, well, subscribe so that you don't miss any more classes. And here are a couple other videos that could be useful for you. See you next time.